As part of ongoing efforts under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity at the Conference of the Parties in 2010, Canada signed on to the commitment to protect at least 17% of land and 10% of coastal and marine areas by the year 2020. The clock is ticking, and while the federal government's most recent budget makes a $1.3 billion commitment to boost conservation efforts, meeting the target is far from certain. With us now for more on this country's progress on conservation, in Ottawa, Eli Enns, co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, or ICE, and a visiting research fellow at the University of Victoria's Centre for Global Studies. And back here in our studio, Janet Sumner, Executive Director, Wildlands League, and co-chair of the Minister of the Environment's National Advisory Panel, Andrea Olive, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and James Snyder, Vice President in Science, Research, and Innovation at the World Wildlife Fund Canada. And it is a delight to welcome you three here to our studios. Eli, good to have you on the line from the nation's capital. And let me just keep it there in Ottawa for a second. I want to go quickly around the four of you right now to see what letter grade, I'm making you all teachers for the moment, would you assign the current state of conservation in Canada? Eli, go first.
Well, the current state, I guess, would be an E for effort.
E for effort, but not much better than that, eh?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's getting better all the time, so we're very optimistic.
E for effort with a little optimism on the way. Okay, Andrea, how about you?
I'm a professor and a notoriously hard grader. It's going to be probably in the failing, but, you know, I would encourage the student to stay in the class, so there's hope.
F, but come to class and maybe you can do better.
Yeah.
Okay. Janet, how about you?
Well, you can't do much better than an F or worse than an F, but we're last in the G7. So I would have to be somewhere around Eli's E for effort and Andrea's F, but stay in class.
No kidding. Okay, How about you, James?
Perhaps a D. I do believe very clearly that there's a lot of work to be done, but the indication is they're trending in the right direction, so hoping that is going upwards.
You are all extremely difficult markers, obviously, not just the one who actually teaches at UTM. But let's see what the WWF had to say about this, okay? We got a little video outlining some of the issues, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, you want to run this? Go.
The results are in from WWF's comprehensive study on Canadian wildlife populations. Mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians were examined in habitats across the country. And the news is not good. Since 1970, half the species we studied have suffered population declines. Those in decline have dropped by an average of 83%. If we continue with business as usual, we risk losing some species from Canada entirely.
That's a snippet from the whole video, which only goes about a minute long, but it manages to encapsulate in that minute actually quite a lot about what's going on right now. Before you undertook that, are those the results you thought you were going to see?
No, I think like many Canadians, we expected that biodiversity loss, wildlife loss is largely an international issue. It's something that we expect on a global stage in other countries. And there hadn't necessarily been that same understanding of the plight of wildlife here. And with Living Planet Report Canada, very clearly widespread and dramatic declines right across the country from coast to coast to coast, which was very eye-opening, not only for us at WWF Canada, but also, I think, for many Canadians.
Do a follow-up. What are some of the explanations you have for the significant downturn?
Well, really, the primary drivers of biodiversity loss, wildlife loss include habitat loss, fragmentation, as well as pollution, and climate change, of course, is increasingly important, as well as invasive species. And where the really important issue here is that it's the multitude of these factors. It's not any single one driver. It's the combination of them in a cumulative way, multiple synergistic and growing impacts. And again, climate change is adding a whole other wrinkle into what would be, a very difficult issue in the first place.
Andrea, I want to find out from you, given that we passed something called the Species at Risk Act more than 15 years ago, why that seems not to have done the job.
Yeah, and one of the surprising things is that the species that are listed on the Act aren't faring better, right? We didn't see that as sort of the trend, and you think, well, isn't this law doing anything? And it's partly, you know, we did pass this law in 2002, and it's the nature of the federal government has pretty limited. They can only protect federal lands, which is about 10% of lands outside the north, and then some migratory birds, some aquatic species. So it's a federal law, but it applies to very limited places across the country, and it's up to the provinces then. So the Species at Risk Act is very narrow in scope.
And therefore, if it only applies to federal law and the feds have jurisdiction over such a small amount, it's not going to be able to do very much.
No, it's very limited.
Okay, Janet, what's the biggest challenge to helping Canadian wildlife facing organizations such as yours?
Well, I think that what we need to start moving on some of the issues that James brought up, which is the climate change and biodiversity are inextricably linked. So getting a good plan on climate change is important. And also moving forward with our commitments internationally, which is this idea that we have to move forward with the 17% and perhaps go further, which is where the science is going.
Eli, let me get you in the conversation in as much as I want to know what you think we've missed out on by not integrating Indigenous knowledge of land with Western approaches sooner.
Yeah. Well, the global research is fairly clear. There's an intimate and inextricable link between cultural and linguistic diversity and biological diversity. Where there are islands of intact, thriving biodiversity around the world, there are also islands of intact, thriving cultural and linguistic diversity. And within those languages and within those cultures are tailored knowledge systems to good stewardship of biodiversity and general ecosystem health and well-being. And so from an Indigenous perspective, what's causing this problem is internal discontinuity. And from our inner world, we're manifesting, dysfunctional relationships with one another and dysfunctional relationships with biodiversity, or the species of other, the community of other species that we share the environment with.
So let me follow up, Eli. I want to make sure I'm clear on this, in as much as had Indigenous and non-Indigenous been working together in partnership earlier on, do you think it's likely we wouldn't be in the pickle we find ourselves in today?
Yes, I agree with that statement wholeheartedly.
Okay, let's bring up some stats here to help, set up the table here for discussion. Sheldon, if you could bring this graphic up here. Here's our stat board number one. This is the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and here's what our commitment as Canadians is to the year 2020. At least 17% of terrestrial areas and inland waters, 10% of marine areas, coastal and marine areas. Can I just get, Jen, you want to just define what all that means to start with?
Sure. The inland waters and, it's land and inland waters, so it's a freshwater system. So we want to make sure that our ecosystems basically on land are functioning. But then you also have the marine scape, and that actually comes a little bit inland as well. You can have marine come the coastal area and right out into the oceans. And so basically that's the two parts of the international commitment and what Canada should be doing.
And when we say the commitment is to protect at least 17% of these areas, that doesn't sound like very much, actually.
Well, I agree, Steve. I think that's what was negotiated. It was negotiated that we would get to the 17% with a view that that was the first benchmark, that we would go further than that. And really what it says is not just that we're going to do 17%, but that we're going to make sure that ecosystems are thriving and functioning. And so for Canada, it's going to mean that we need to see 17% as the first step, and then go beyond that and actually figure out what does nature need to be healthy.
Because it almost suggests, Andrea, like we are committing to 17% protection, but what, we don't give a damn about the other 83%? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, no. So the other 80, yes and no, but the other 83% is urban areas, is agricultural areas, is other mixed land use, right? Although I will say, like, it's a contested definition of what is a protected area. So, I mean...
What do you take it to mean?
Well, I mean, in Canada, it's where nature conservation is supposed to be the primary, I guess, value or the primary emphasis, but it doesn't always rule out other. I mean, obvious recreation is included in most protected areas, but in some protected areas, so is industrial activity, or, you know, we can have forestry, we can have, in some cases, hydraulic fracturing inside a park or inside what might constitute a protected area. So it's sort of this question of protected from what, right? And I think that's a important discussion.
Okay. In which case, James, do you have a good sense about how much we are actually trying to protect here?
No, I think that there, as Janet said, very clearly the CBD commitment in terms of 17% needs to be the floor and not the ceiling in terms of what we as Canada and really globally need to be committing to in terms of our protected areas and building these conservation landscapes where we have connections between our protected areas and our other, as you say, working landscapes. The protected areas are a backbone, but it can't be our only strategy in terms of the recovery and protection of wildlife and species at risk in Canada. It's part of the solution, but it's not the only part.
Okay, to that end then, Eli, I'm going to come back to you now because you're one of the co-chairs of one of the groups providing the federal government with recommendations to meet the goals that we've been talking about here. I gather you just provided your recommendations to the federal government this past weekend. So what were your findings, in fact?
Yeah, we are actually presenting our report tomorrow. We're having a ceremony in Ottawa with elders from across Canada and the National Steering Committee for the Pathway, the National Advisory Panel, and the Indigenous Circle of Experts with Minister McKenna. And we are going to be presenting our reports in ceremony. And number one, we're in regards to the 83 and 17% that you're just speaking of, from an Indigenous worldview and through our meetings with Indigenous communities from across the country, the point that we want to emphasize is that there is a way to create sustainable economies that not only fail to compromise future generations' ability to meet their needs, but also create more abundancy in the system. Our elders teach us that there are ways of interacting with the environment that cultivates more abundancy in the ecosystem. And so this was an overarching theme within the conversations that we had. You'll find that in the report. And also appropriate recognition and honoring the peace and friendship treaties. Built into the constitutional foundation stones of this country is a commitment to respect one another and to respect the land and the water that we all depend on.
All right, so the federal government is going to get your recommendations. How confident are you that something's going to happen?
Well, we're feeling very confident. We have a year and a half of engagement, and in that year and a half, we've been continually testing the waters of good faith. And the folks that we're working with within Parks Canada and with Environment Climate Change Canada, the provinces and territories that are participating in the process, we have found that the staff there are all very knowledgeable, very caring, and want to work with us in the true spirit and practice of reconciliation. And so we're feeling optimistic. You know, as you heard earlier, there's not we can't go too much further down, so there's only one way to go, which is up. Okay,
to that end, Andrea, I want to bring you into the mix here because you were telling us earlier that the feds actually only have carriage of about 10% of the land, so it's a small percentage of the problem. The provinces have the biggest say in all of this, in which case, how well are individual provinces doing on conservation to help move the yardsticks along?
There's not many A's in that class either, unfortunately. So you know, most provinces do have sort of standalone species at risk legislation that they've created since the National Accord in 1996, but the whole western half of the country does not. So Saskatchewan does not, Alberta does not, British Columbia does not, the Yukon does not. So that's a big problem. And then again, the provinces that do, they're not protecting habitat, they're not going after connected habitat, they're failing to list species. So we still have a lot of problems at the provincial level across the provinces.
How's Ontario doing?
Yeah, Ontario likes to this claim that they have the strongest Endangered Species Act, and I'd say that's true on paper, but the problem has been in implementation, which is something a lot of provinces struggle with. But they exempted industry, right? They exempted almost every industry from the main, you know, regulatory provisions in the ESA. So when you don't have forestry, when you don't have hydro, when you don't have mining, all of that is exempt. Then that's a problem for protecting habitat. So even Ontario is not they might be the head of the class. I don't know. Manitoba's done some interesting stuff. Nova Scotia, you know, so it would be hard, but yeah.
How would you rate Ontario's performance so far?
I would say it would be really nice if provinces started to step up and compete to be the best. And I'm with Andrea. I think that one of the challenges is we had the gold standard in an Endangered Species Act and then undermined it through exemption. Ontario sits at about somewhere between 9 and 10% in terms of protection. So we have a bit of a way to go, and we haven't done any new protection since Lands for Life, which is 2.4 million hectares. And so we've got to do another 6. And we need to get on with that.
Lands for Life was the Mike Harris government.
Yes, it was.
I know it sometimes drives left-wing downtown Toronto types crazy to know that actually the most adventurous, ambitious environmental initiative on conservation was done by Michael Dean Harris.
Yes. Yes.
That's a yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting. Okay, let me come at you with this, okay? When I talk to the people who represent all those folks who got exemptions, right? The people up north who run the sawmills, and who maybe do the mining and the other industries. One of the things they say is, yes, they care about conservation, but they think you folks are all way too worried about conservation at the expense of 75% unemployment rates on some reserves in Northern Ontario. And they wonder if there's not a happy place to meet somewhere in the middle on this. What do you say to them?
Well, I think that this has been dichotomy, the polarization of environment versus the economy. And we've seen that loud and clear in the last few weeks, certainly on woodland caribou in Alberta and Quebec. And we know that, if anything, that in the discourse, the question of sustainable management is actually being left behind. Our ability to manage these landscapes in a way that meet these multiple benefits, that allow for economic development, that allow for protection of these critical habitats for species and species at risk, that is possible. There's good examples of it, but where in many ways that paradigm, that idea, we're moving away from it. We're saying it's actually not possible to do so. And I think that's actually a step backwards in the conversation. Well,
okay, Henry, let me do a follow-up with you, because again, folks in forestry will say that what they want to harvest is a tiny percentage of what is available out there to harvest, and that folks like you are way too worried about the status of the caribou and not nearly worried enough about skyrocketing unemployment rates in parts of the province that are desperate for economic activity.
Yeah, but the jobs versus economy sort of or jobs versus environment dichotomy doesn't work in the sense that the environment's always going to be the economy, right? And so we need sustainable forestry. We need these sustainable practices. But I think conservation.
Say both. They want to have jobs and environment.
Right. But I think there's lots of creative ways that we can open up that conversation and work together. And I mean that honestly. I mean, maybe I don't have a forestry example, but something like, I study the grasslands prairies, so agriculture there, huge, right? If we want to look at ways in Saskatchewan to pay farmers to leave intact prairie on their ground as like carbon offsets or something, come up with some strategies to do that. There's lots of creative ways out there to work with the people who are on the ground managing the land that we maybe can do a lot more of both than we think, that it isn't a dichotomy.
Sure.
Yeah, I want to speak to that. So I've worked on caribou planning across this country. Okay. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario. I was just up in Cochrane last week, and the mayor of Cochrane and I were at an event where we had the wonderful fritters from the folks up there, Fresh and Fancy. But we've been able to get caribou plans in with companies, with mayors, with Indigenous people, and we had the chief there from Taquatagamu First Nation. Moose Cree supports this plan. We've got a plan for caribou that actually sees mills continue, sees jobs continue, sees a potential for a new protected area and a better outcome for caribou. And all of this we put in place and have asked the province to move forward with it, and they're not doing it. The same thing has also occurred in Alberta, and in Saskatchewan we've had actually a little bit more luck because the minister at the time was Minister Moe, and he's actually interested in this plan and he wants to see it go forward.
He's the premier now.
He's the premier now. So I think when you've got willing hearts and open minds that you can actually sit down and start to crack it open, it gets very difficult when you try to create province-wide regulatory frameworks and impose them in a way that doesn't take into account the very specific dynamics in a location where you've got caribou ranges that work completely differently if you're in northeastern Alberta versus west central Alberta.
Sure.
And so you actually really have to design it. You have to tailor it.
Well, let me get Eli to weigh in on this. And Eli, I wonder, given all the different players who are at the table here, federal governments, provincial governments, territorial governments, indigenous communities, private landowners, industry. I mean, there's any number of different stakeholders here who all need to have their say on this. Do you think it's possible at the end of the day to find that sweet spot that gets everybody together?
Yeah, definitely. And we have an example of that on the west coast of Vancouver Island, where we have the Haukeman Tribal Park, the Tlaoquiet Tribal Parks, which are examples of Indigenous protected and conserved areas working within and complementary to the Clayoquot Sound UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. So the Man in the Biosphere program has this idea of core protected areas and zones of sustainable use. A very similar method as which was followed with the Great Bear Rainforest, where you have core conservancies and you have zones of ecosystem-based management. So on the west coast of Vancouver Island, we have an example of where it's not a perfect model, but we've been at it for about 34 years now, plus. And it's something that you can go and see how we've created diversity in our economy, how we've maintained cultural and linguistic diversity, and the kind of positive biodiversity outcomes that we're benefiting from as a result. So in addition to Indigenous protected and conserved areas, the government is currently also supporting a project through Environment Climate Change Canada to support the Canadian Biosphere Reserve Association, which represents 18 biosphere reserves across the country. And these are proving to be sort of laboratories of innovation for striking that balance between biodiversity and sustainable development.
Okay, to that end, Andrea, let me bring you in on, well, as Woodward and Bernstein used to say, let's follow the money, okay? Here's the money that the feds allocated in their last budget, $1.3 billion over 5 years towards nature conservation efforts. How would you characterize the size of that contribution?
I think it's great. I think they're doing what they need to do. They need to lead. They need to put their money behind this initiative. I think unless they can get buy-in from the provinces, unless they can get into this the nature fund that they have, if they can get the buy-in from other stakeholders, from private landowners, that will be key. But it's definitely a step in the right, more than a step, it's a leap in the right direction.
A leap in the right direction.
For the federal government here.
You're co-chair of an advisory panel for
That's
them, right?
Yeah.
So
yes.
Presumably they asked your opinion about that number when it came out?
They didn't ask my opinion about the number when it came out, but let's just say, like Eli, our report is going through ceremony tomorrow. Okay. And like Eli, I'll give you a taste of it, which is that when we looked at the issue, we said, why are we not moving in Canada? Why haven't we been able to go from 10.5 to 17 in 8 years? And the single answer for that is because we don't have anything driving conservation. And how do you drive things in Canada? You do it through investment, whether it's health accord or infrastructure. You need to have big dollars. And the federal government has taken that step.
These are big dollars.
These are big dollars. It's the single largest investment in conservation in Canadian history. So to take this step and move this forward, and as Andrea said, now we need to see the provinces actually respond in turn, because the $500 million that they've put in place, or they're putting in place for the Nature Fund, requires cost sharing. And so it doesn't mean that the feds are going to come in and pay for everything, because they don't have control over all those lands. Well, so we need provinces and territories to step up with cost sharing and see it in their budgets as well.
So just as Paul Martin, when he was Prime Minister,
yes,
created a health accord.
Yes.
Remember, he brought all the first ministers
yes.
together to Ottawa. They hammered out an agreement that was supposed to, save healthcare for a generation. It, may or may not have, but at least they got a deal.
Yeah.
Do we need that approach for this as well?
I think that's a great idea, Steve.
Because they don't seem to be doing it, though.
No, they haven't done it yet, but they've also taken this large step now, and how you structure that nature fund, and do you have a health accord, something similar to a health accord? I think that is a question for the minister, and we'll wait to see how they actually structure the money and where it goes.
Where should it go first?
Well, I think the question of ramping up. So there's the near-term phase in terms of delivery of our CBD commitments, right? So we only have 2 years, really, to get to 17%, and that's a long way. And so securing effective protection of areas in a systematic way that has value for wildlife, that has a high degree or at least a minimum standard of what protection means, will be really important. But also recognizing that this should be ramping forward. that we're beginning a process now that should be ongoing, that for us to effectively reverse these declines in wildlife that we've seen right across the country, this is going to take a sustained commitment to the protection and recovery of wildlife and nature. And so early wins here will be really important, but it's only the beginning.
Eli, I gather some of the money is actually earmarked for indigenous land. And to that end, what would you like to see that money spent on?
Well, we're looking at this as an economic stimulus package for building the conservation economy. We understand that investing in the health and well-being of ecosystems will have snowball benefits to health, to reducing the cost of health care, for food security and healthy traditional food systems, which again has health benefits, but also in terms of the local microeconomics for communities to be able to maintain traditional food systems and access to healthy protein. So this for us is a leap in the right direction for sure. And when you invest those dollars in a good way, from our perspective, we can set something into motion that will then gather more economic investment down the road.
I don't want to be killjoy here, but I am going to read a quote from Elizabeth May, the recently arrested Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party, as quoted maybe a month or so ago in the National Post. And she and the forestry industry actually agree on something here. Here's the quote. Sheldon, if you would. The horrific reality of conservation of nature in 2018 is you can draw a line around something and the species inside that line will still die if the climate changes under them. Andrea, true? You agree?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So these two things are linked: climate change and biodiversity loss, absolutely. And if the main drive, I mean, she was saying that in relation, I believe, to a pipeline going into British Columbia. So if
fits for this too, though.
Right. So if the main driver of biodiversity loss, well, one of the main drivers is climate change. If we're not also doing something to address climate change, right, there's no sort of it's going to be a lost cause to also.
In which case, Janet, should the accent be on dealing with climate change, and then presumably biodiversity takes care of itself once you do that?
No, because according to many scientists, you can actually achieve a third of the Paris Agreement through the nature solution. We've got the most massive carbon storehouse in the Hudson Bay and James Bay lowlands, and actually getting a strategy around conservation for those would be an enormous benefit to climate change. And I would say that, yes, there are some species that will disappear on the lands that you may protect, but the other piece of that is that we actually have to build resiliency. And the way that we do that is by creating networks of protection, and it will actually mean that we will lose less than if we didn't do anything. And then I'll just finish off this with, when we looked at could we achieve the 17%, the National Advisory Panel came down on the side of yes, we can. With a very, very conservative lens, we looked at a number of protected area proposals that already exist in Canada, and you can already get half the way there with proposals that exist today. So with a little bit more creativity, a massive big carrot that is being offered now by the federal government, and hopefully others who will step up, whether it's private land, provinces and territories, and actually get this machinery going.
In our last few minutes here, James, I do want to get into a bit of a discussion about there are myriad things that myriad groups want the public to care about. And, of course, this is one of them. This is one of the most important ones that people want people to care about. But you're in competition with a lot of other things that are equally as important. How do you make the case?
Well, I think Canadians recognize how important the environment and biodiversity concerns are. Every day we get questions of, well, what can I do? And that's the central question, is moving from the awareness to actually delivery in terms of the role of the individual, role of the community, role of the family, and also recognizing that this isn't just the responsibility of government and industry, that we as Canadians each have a collective part of the solution here, and that we can take meaningful action in terms of addressing climate change, in terms of working to reverse wildlife decline. It is possible. Individuals inherently have an important part in that solution.
Well, okay, but having said that, I'm going to push back a bit here. Andrea, you know, for a lot of people in this country, they live in cities. The closest they're going to come to a caribou is the stuffed one that's on their kid's pillow when they go to bed at night.
Yeah.
How do you get them to care about biodiversity and this kind of issue?
Well, I mean, everyone likes clean air, clean water. You like food, right? That all comes from wildlife. Medicine, that comes from wildlife. So, I mean, you already do care, right, about these things. You may not be able to immediately grasp, although caribou is sort of easy. That's like people, that's a Canadian icon, right? That's a charismatic species. I feel like it's harder like the slugs or the insects or the, where it's not exactly clear to people how that fits into the ecosystem and why that's important. I think the caribou, I think, is maybe a bit easier, actually. But again, I don't think it's that people don't care. I think people have an outpouring of love for nature in this country. It is sort of this, but how do I help? What can I do for the caribou that where people can sometimes get lost?
Eli, in our last 30 seconds, you want to give people some advice on if they want to care and want to do what they should care and do?
Well, I would say learn about the origin story of Canada. The peace and friendship treaties are Euro-Indigenous social innovations that have a lot to offer all of us in terms of reconciliation between the Crown and Indigenous nations, reconciliation with the land, but also internal reconciliation. The disconnect from nature, the disconnect from one another leaves a lot of people that you've described in those urban centers feeling disconnected and lonely. And so understanding where you are, understanding who you are and where you're from and how you're connected, I think would go a long ways towards the kind of transformative change that we need to get back on track in a good way.
Reconnecting with nature is always brilliant advice. That's Eli Enns, who's co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts. Good luck with your event tomorrow, Eli, and we thank you for coming on the program tonight. Andrea Olive, Associate Professor, Political Science, University of Toronto, Mississauga. Janet Sumner, Executive Director, Wildlands League, and James Snyder, VP, Research and Innovation with WWF Canada. Good of all of you to come on TVO tonight and share your views with us. Thank you so much. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.